Hello, everybody. My name is James Causey. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Spaceport Alliance, and welcome all of you to our webinar series. Today, we have a really interesting panel that we put together covering a subject that I think all of you will find absolutely fascinating: navigating risk and strategies for spaceport resilience. Now, as we have set this webinar up, we really want to encourage questions to the panelists. So feel free to use the chat section to ask your questions. Okay, with that said, I'd like to just cover a couple of quick items. First of all, I want to say thank you to our sponsors. Our platinum sponsors are RS&H, American company, gold sponsors BRPH, Parsons, and the Italian Trade Agency, and our silver sponsors, HDR and MITRE Corporation. Now, frankly, thanks to their support and a lot of interest in what GSA has been doing, we've been able to increase our membership since the summit meeting in January by 15 new members. And what's most exciting about this is that these members represent many different countries. MIRA on the bottom right, for example, is South Africa. EIE is Italy. Innovative Space Carrier is Japan. NLA is the UK. And so we're really increasing and continuing to increase our international participation. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't also just mention that we're just in the process of starting the development of the Spaceport Summit that will take place in January. The timing of this particular webinar and all of our efforts towards the summit are really starting to build. We encourage you to put this on your calendar as quickly as possible because, as usual, the Spaceport Summit kicks off what we call Commercial Space Week. And that is where we have the Space Mobility Show with the US Space Force and also SpaceCom, which is the commercial space event itself. Now, also, if you are on the call and you're not a member, we really do encourage you to consider membership. There are a number of benefits that accrue as a result of membership in GSA. You have sponsor and promotion opportunities, up to 3 Spaceport Summit tickets, and a number of other things. If you're interested in this, please let myself know, or Izzy, or Steve Wolf, and we will follow up with you immediately. Now, what I'd like to do now, turn it over to our moderator for today's discussion, Bernie McShae, who will introduce himself and the rest of the panelists. Thank you very much. And Bernie, over to you.
Thank you, James. Good evening to our members in Asia. Good afternoon to our members in Europe and Africa. And good morning still to members in the Americas. And if any of our members are at the Paris Air Show, I think it's 5 o'clock local time in Paris. I hope you are enjoying a beverage of your choice at this point. I remember those days, and those are some very long days working the air show. My name's Bernie McShae. I'm managing principal of the McShae Group, LLC. I have an economic development background. My tie to the industry is from Space, Florida. I go back to 2008 when I was recruited to be the founding vice president of business development there. During my time at Space, Florida, I led some of the very large successful projects, recruiting in Blue Origin's rocket manufacturing facility, also in the broader aerospace world, Northrop Grumman's $500 million B-21 investment at the Melbourne airport. Very early kind of in the spaceport era, I was integral in our efforts to go under an enhanced use lease with NASA Kennedy Space Center to take 200 acres of what were fallow orange groves and get access to that. And we made that into Exploration Park, which is where OneWeb Satellite is based, Blue Origin, and some others. I'd like to go through our panel. I'm going to introduce Each of the panelists give you some background on their biography, what perspective they bring to our discussion today. And then we have some questions we're going to start with, and we'll open up the chat to questions. Please place your questions in the chat, and we will definitely make sure to get to questions from the member attendees as well. We're going to start with Mike Kuchler. Mike oversees Deloitte's space portfolio of commercial space integration and spaceport development programs. He has 16 years of experience in federal consulting and international emerging markets, focusing on finance, strategic planning, program management, business model transformation, and legislative policy in the aerospace and defense sectors. In this capacity, Mike has served as an advisor to the Space Force, as well as state-sponsored private and global spaceports. Okay, next, we have Andy Anderegg, and Andy is a last-minute substitution for Tim Gruber, who fortunately had an emergency come up this morning. Thanks, Andy, for filling in at the last minute. So Andy was previously a CAASD portfolio director for CNSATM before joining Labs in 2017. Since joining MITRE in 1994, Andy has served in increasingly key roles in shaping aerospace industry advances. Andy was instrumental in establishing NextGen with agency leaders, both civil and military, following 9/11. As part of this work, he was asked to architect a national plan for the future of air transportation to align aviation efforts across DoD, DHS, DOT, DOC, and NASA with White House and industry buy-in. This began 20-year public-private partnership for next-gen aviation that led to a new push for avionics, changes in airport threat assessment, and the concept of aviation safety, information analysis, and sharing. ACS, if I'm saying that acronym right. More recently, as MITRE's surface-to-space architect of the L250 Innovation Center, he facilitated a whole-of-nation approach for managing the risks from commercialization of space with the Aspen Institute, industry, DOC, the Department of Commerce, NASA, the FAA, and the U.S. Spaceport. He led the intelligent domain strategy for labs and a related MIP challenge on post-disaster recovery coordination, emphasizing how private sector coordination shapes national outcomes. Okay, and then we've got Rich Durenzio next, who is the founder and CEO of Kaiser Solutions, KSI, based in Ormond Beach, Florida. KSI is a U.S. veteran-owned small business tailoring specialized services to companies in aerospace and other industries. We bring deep industry and government expertise to assist companies with risk assessment and mitigation, crisis management, spaceport operations and profitability, protection of critical infrastructure, as well as other professional services. KSI with U.S. government clients, state and local authorities, and provides liaison services to private companies interacting with U.S. government agencies. KSI also partners with CDI Global to provide buy and build solutions as well as M&A support. We partner with Nestor Health and Performance, which is a cognitive performative performance company with direct application to aerospace companies and space-facing clients, spacefaring clients. Prior to Kaiser Solutions, Rich was a senior CIA director of operations officer for 18 years. He served in command positions in Latin America, South Asia, Europe, and at CIA headquarters. Rich also worked closely with C-suite leaders in the U.S. finance, technology, and energy sectors. Rich served for 12 years as a U.S. Army intelligence officer and paratrooper. He served domestically and overseas, acquiring deep expertise in the security of installations and critical infrastructure. And then moving on to Chris. Chris Hunstatter with Trident Space is a recognized leader in space risk management and insurance. For over 4 decades, He has worked closely with global satellite operators and manufacturers, launch providers, industry groups, and others to develop cutting-edge solutions that enable investment and innovation in space. Chris has collaborated with policymakers and space agencies around the world to enhance space safety and promote responsible space activity. Chris was recently global head of space at AXA XL and managed the company's space insurance team. He was actively involved in all of AXA XL's space activity, including technical, financial, and actuarial analysis, coverage design, claims handling, industry outreach, strategy, and business development. Chris received a BA degree in literature and an MS degree in engineering from the University of California. He holds a commercial pilot license with instrument and multi-engine ratings and is a certified flight instructor. Additionally, Chris is an avid musician and serves on the board of several music-oriented not-for-profits. So, with all the introductions done, let's get right into some questions. And I'm going to start off with Mike. Mike, let's start with a broad brush. What are the key categories of financial and operational risks that spaceports should consider?
Great, thanks, Bernie. Appreciate you leading this discussion, and also just wanted to thank the GSA briefly for hosting this exciting development. So just starting with some of the broad categories, I thought this would be a good way to kick things off and maybe stimulate some other questions from the audience. You know, when it comes to financial and operational risks, some of the key risks are not having great answers to some of the following questions. So if we think about things in the financial bucket, you start with capital investment planning and financing. You know, what's your spaceports business plan? Where are the capital investments going to come from to meet the goals laid out in the business plan? A lot of spaceports depend on a combination of state and local private financing. There's also spaceports that are receiving federal funding as well. And so what's the business plan? What's the market niche, and how is that spaceport going to compete? Within costs and revenues, on the revenue side, you know, what customer needs is your spaceport going to address? How are you going to organize, advertise, deliver those services? What commercial space companies or what kind of anchor tenants are you targeting or interested in within your business plan? And are you considering government-sponsored space activities, and do those factor into your revenue streams as well? On the cost side of the equation, you know, how can spaceports develop sustainably, investing in the infrastructure required to attract core tenants, but also planning to scale to increase capacity as that demand grows? So those are just some key questions on the financial side. On the operational side, you know, I like to think about a market-focused approach to spaceport development. So thinking about what are the market demands that the spaceport's going to meet, and how will you become and stay competitive? Sometimes we see sort of a notion of, if we build it, they will come, but rather, what's the demand signal, and where is your spaceport going to focus within the market? Other operational considerations are regulatory, including spaceport licensing, the hurdles involved with that, as well as international trade agreements. On the safety side, of course, maintaining an excellent track record of safety and efficiency, while also balancing promoting ease of doing business for your tenants. And speaking of safety, you know, there's some key technological risks as well. Not only how will the spaceport stay on top of the technological curve to reduce costs through automation and improve ease of doing business, but also thinking about the risks, the technology risks, to include the risk of cyber attacks, which are increasing in this environment and could be more of a challenge in any kind of emerging conflict situation as well. So hopefully that starts out with some broad strokes to get everyone thinking about those, and happy to deep dive on any of those.
Thanks so much, Mike. That was a great overview of very comprehensive of the risks that spaceports look at. So next we're going to move over to Andy and talk about some specific risks. Andy, what are risks that launch operators, i.e. the customers of the spaceports, should be concerned with?
Yeah, thanks, Bernie, and thanks for including me, GSA, in this. I want to build off of Mike's thing, pivot a little bit to the operational and technical risks that launch operators might consider, right? Certainly, there's the ability to execute all of the steps from preparation through launch and recovery of any reusable elements. Like, how are the spaceports positioned to help in that success? There are, environmental concerns like weather and other things that might drive scrub rates. Certainly delays or disappointments in operational tempo. And then there's probably the, what is their failure risks and the scenarios that would expose population, their licensing, and affect really ultimately their licensing ability to be licensed to launch from a specific location.
Okay, thank you. Rich, as we go around kind of the whole sort of threat assessment picture, what do you see some of the threats that are facing spaceports?
Well, I would say that, unfortunately, space is now a theater of war. And I mean, if you look at what Starlink did for Ukraine and their ability to fight against Russia, I think that's a good example. So hopefully not, but if there is a major conflict, each side is going to look to knock out the other's space-based capability, primarily to deny communications, imagery, and geolocational services. This will probably be done either by a cyber attack. So a cyber attack, cybersecurity is very important, or direct action in space, or potentially even targeting ground facilities, such as a spaceport. And then after that, I think the next phase of the conflict would be to prevent countries from launching new capabilities back into space to restore that capability. So I think spaceports crisis management and resilience will be, key planning factors going forward. I think spaceport managers should ask themselves, what's going to be our role if there is indeed a conflict, and what are we going to be asked to do by our country, by our state, and by our vendors and customers?
Wow. Yeah, that's all very important things to think about. I think potentially if within your whoever handles emergency management in your jurisdiction in the United States, if the state, internationally, maybe a different entity, it's good. Sounds like it's good to get to know those individuals, right, in that agency.
Absolutely. Should know the people and be able to call them so they'll pick up on the first ring.
Yeah, excellent counsel. Thank you. Chris, in the early days of Space Florida, we were trying to find, as we tried to learn about the satellite industry and how insurance worked, we were trying to figure out other kind of business analogs for it. And what we found out, and this was in the very early days of commercial space before SpaceX had successfully flown anything, that really there was only one analog we found, kind of deep ocean maritime seemed to have some similarities. And given that this is such a very, very unique type of insurance, I think it would really be helpful for our members if you could kind of give us just an overview of how the insurance market works for satellites.
Sure. Thanks very much. And it's great to be here with some on the panel with some very smart, very capable people. So I spent a number of years as a space insurance underwriter, writing mostly launch and in-orbit insurance for launch vehicles and satellites, doing some insurance for spaceports and other types of facilities. It's important to understand that insurance is a key part of risk management for any sort of facility, and it's often an afterthought. And so it's very important to get involved with insurance early on. The key point is that you have insurance for the facilities themselves, physical damage insurance, but you also need to consider insurance for liability to either the parties who are using the facility or third parties who may be surrounding or nearby. as Rich just pointed out, the fact that the space domain has become an arena for conflict does mean that there are threats that we hadn't seen before for facilities like spaceports. So it's important to understand that there is insurance for spaceports. The analog that we use in the business is looking at airports, but also other transportation and transshipment facilities like oil storage facilities and the like. The insurance that is available typically excludes war and cyber and other conflict risks. There is a separate market for that, but it's important to recognize that it'll be a sort of a bifurcated insurance placement, because the physical damage coverage and the liability coverage will really cover the operations at the facility itself. When it comes to war and cyber, that would be a separate insurance policy.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Maybe a quick follow-up on that, Chris. Have you seen the government sponsors of spaceports willing to take on some of that risk, or is it typically where the spaceport is on its own to go out and insure?
So a lot of that has to do with who owns the facility and who runs it. The federal government, through say the FAA, doesn't offer any sort of indemnification or anything like that, but does come up with the requirements for the operators themselves to buy insurance, for the launch operators to buy insurance for damage to government property and third-party bodily injury and property damage. But it really depends. For example, if it's a municipality or a state facility, then there may be some touch points there with insurance for those agencies.
Yeah, that's good to know. So, well, hopefully this initial round of questions is kind of set the stage for all of the different risks that spaceport operators need to be taking into account, and is spurring some thinking. And so, going back to Mike, how can startup spaceports work to mitigate risks via a feasibility analysis, and what are some of the key elements to study?
Yeah, in my overview, kind of talked about what are some of those key questions that spaceports really need to have worked out in their business plan in order to avoid or mitigate some of these risks. And so we see that a really robust feasibility analysis can help identify answers to a lot of those questions. When we think about, I'll generalize and say spaceports are generally competing on a global market for core and anchor tenants. Those anchor tenants have a number of considerations, but some really big ones are geolocation. What's the geolocation and how does that impact orbital mechanics for them? As well as what are some of the costs of doing business, both in terms of monetary costs, regulatory costs, sort of pain points, versus what can the spaceport and whoever sponsoring that spaceport do to help alleviate some of those costs via investment attraction. So when thinking about through the feasibility analysis, a lot of those key questions kind of get to the heart of that. Where does the spaceport want to play? What are some of its competitive advantages, and how can it maximize those? And out in the public domain, in the US, a number of state-sponsored spaceports have started going through this process. There's one pretty recent that I'll call out in the Utah state legislature that really does a pretty nice job laying out a number of those key questions. So leverage that, but it's available if anyone wants to look it up as well. If you start with a market analysis, what's the key demand, including potential government clients, commercial clients, international customers, and who are your competitors? And if you think about sort of the broad categories of services that a spaceport can offer, that's of course launch, recovery, scientific missions, national defense, commercial space. Point to point is something that we're seeing some increasing momentum on within the market. space cargo and resupply, space tourism, and of course, industry research and development. I know that that the GSA likes to say, hey, spaceport is more than just launching the rockets. There's a whole lot involved in that whole ecosystem. The other side of that is not only what's going to be offered, but what's the economic impact of bringing that investment to the spaceport in terms of job creation, local business growth, what are the revenues going to be like, what's the profit and loss to the spaceport itself, who are those projected customers, and what are those benefits to the host state or nation state that's hosting that spaceport. So really getting into that, making sure that you have pretty detailed cost estimates and projections. And then the other key element that I would bring up is the siting analysis. If customers are thinking about how easy or painful is it going to be to invest in this location, but also what is the siting going to mean in terms of orbital mechanics? So the geographic and environmental considerations, what's your site's planned size, location, what's the environmental impact? Is that site remote enough to minimize risk to populated areas? Does it comply with those environmental regulations? At the same time, is the site so remote that it's very difficult to get equipment in and out of that location that would make it less competitive? So those are just a few key considerations there, but welcome any follow-up questions.
Thanks, Mike. Very good points. To your point about how important that upfront market analysis is, one thing that we had to do in Florida, mandated under our state law, was every few years do both a plan for the Cape Canaveral Spaceport, which Space Florida operates, as well, since there are other spaceports across the state, do what's called a systems plan for the entire network of spaceports across Florida. And those were proved to be very valuable exercises in making sure that we were keeping current on where market demand was and trying to get a sense of where it was most likely headed. So I see we've got a question in the chat. So let's take a look at that. As the impact of commercial launch on other aerospace users increases, for example, more flight miles flown by airlines or flight delays, should the launch ecosystem compensate those impacted for their commercial gain? Basically, I think this is asking, should the launch provider or the spaceport pay for the disruption? Anyone on the panel would like to take a stab at that one?
Yeah.
Chris? Or Andy, would you like to?
Yeah,
okay, go ahead, Andy.
And use this. Hold on. Am I muted or am I okay?
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, so because this one kind of ties to, and it's not just the impact on air operators, it's often the impact on sea operators. And from a regulatory perspective, this is frequently a different agency than the one that's actually licensing the launch or the launch the spaceport. And yes, there probably are considerations in the, especially if the sea lanes that you disrupt are in another country. And I think we've got to seriously consider that as well. But when we think about launch operations in the United States, we think in terms of, trying to minimize the disruption to both the sea lanes and the air lanes. And frequently, if you think about it in monetary terms, it'll actually be the sea lane disruptions that'll actually be higher value than the airlane disruptions.
Yeah, that's a very good point. There's for launches at the Cape, there's a very large exclusion zone that has to be set up. And, even, here we are 25 years into the 21st century, and you still get instances, right, Andy, of a launch delayed. Someone's out there on just an individual fisherman or fisherwoman on their boat, and somehow they didn't get the message that they needed to clear the area. So let's go to a question for Rich. We've talked about a number of different threats over the past half hour. So what are some best practices that spaceports can employ to mitigate these threats?
Well, I would say, I think busy spaceports, and I've seen a bunch down here in Florida, have trouble taking the time sometimes to think strategically. So, I mean, what I would recommend and what I've done with a number of spaceports is do an annual enterprise risk management exercise, just like most high profit companies do around the world. And this type of review will engage your workforce, and it'll bring things up that maybe you weren't aware of, but also it'll provide you with an objective review of productivity, performance metrics, which are very important to maintain competitiveness. It'll talk about liability and a path forward to improve performance. And I think a lot of leading companies, as a result of this exercise, go, oh man, we need to look at some other stuff, such as training your workforce on, personnel security, cybersecurity. I know that's come up in our discussion. Review of insurance coverages, especially a lot of those could be outdated. And more importantly, how best to protect your intellectual property of your spaceport, but also that of your clients. And lastly, I think a good physical inspection of your facility from a security standpoint is very much in your interest.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, it's, with, I think, pretty much all of our spaceport members having a lot to do with the day-to-day, just everything that goes with running a spaceport. It's very easy to get caught up in that day-to-day, and, some of these more strategic elements that you just touched on. I think it's well worth the time to carve out, for an all hands and do that, as you were saying, annually. Really pays off large dividends in the long run, doesn't it? Actually, is there maybe a case example you could cite as the best practice of that?
Yeah, I mean, I've done a few, and I think in Florida at the Cape, we did one that helped Space Florida and others identify the 6 major issues that everybody's trying to solve down there. Fuel, infrastructure, things of that nature, and kind of, I think, got them going on developing a plan on how to solve those. And they're very much on their way. They've put in a really good mitigation plan, and for the next 10, 15 years out. So I think it helped them get ahead of the curve.
And I would think it's, to your point, getting ahead of the curve, very important, because, typically I would think you're getting into some longer lead capital items, and that's going to lead to a whole separate financing strategy on how do you raise the money, find the money to pay for those. Right.
And also, as people have probably seen in the press with Space Florida, talking about their master plan for the Cape, for the management of spaceports, something that usually comes up in these exercises is the importance of one set of regulations, one decision maker, especially with our commercial partners, to lead to efficiency and less delay on actions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good, thank you. So we've got another chat question, and actually I should give credit to who is asking these. The first question was from Nick Robson. This question is from Courtney Compton, project manager. Unfortunately, I can't see your entire title here, Courtney. And so let's see, get back to Courtney's question here. Recommend including license considerations in feasibility analysis. For example, in the United States, 14 CFR Part 420. So I think that, I don't know if anyone on the panel has experience with that. Would you like to address that? Maybe Mike?
I'll keep it brief to say I agree. That's another key consideration
Yeah,
to add to that list. Great add,
I would
Courtney.
think so. Yeah, thank you. So next, we've got a question from Angie Buckley. As this industry continues to grow, any thoughts on workforce development? Thank you, Andy. Very, very important element that we haven't touched on much yet in the discussion. And the risk associated with being able to find, hire, train, and retain individuals with the broad range of skill sets required for successful operations. That's workforce. In any organization, I think we all know the people ultimately are the ones that either make things happen or things do not happen. And it's I think our industry is probably not different from a lot nowadays, where talent recruiting, retention, it's very, very competitive. And particularly a lot of the spaceports or smaller organizations, you can be competing for talent with some of the primes and kind of marquee names. And does anyone have some thoughts on what some good strategies might be there?
Well, I'd say in my work, I run across after companies say they want to relocate to Florida to work in the aerospace industry. The next question is, where am I going to get my workforce? So it's a super important issue. And I think Florida is there's a new consortium where they're working with universities focused on space-related specialties of engineers, et cetera. It's huge, and it's a major planning factor. And I think something that, at least the state of Florida, that's one of the biggest things. They're looking at empowering trade schools, universities to partner with industry to really ramp it up so that companies coming to Florida have a readily available and up-to-date trained workforce.
Thanks, Rich.
And I'd add on to that too. I mean, I agree with everything Rich just said, and I would add, it's a challenging problem because there are things that spaceports can do in the short term to help encourage some of that. That can also go in with the investment attraction package to help co-invest in some of that workforce training and development, better schools, better hospitals, just making the area a nicer place to live generally. But this is also a challenge that can span 20 plus years as you want to make sure that you continue to fill that pipeline with talent. And just one example I'll throw out there is that, I heard recently, if you ask a lot of kids within China, what do you want to be when you grow up? Astronaut, work in the space industry, and that spans from folks that work in astrophysics all the way to people that are bending metal. And in the United States, one of the most popular responses is, I want to be a YouTuber. And so there's a really powerful cultural phenomenon that goes into developing that robust workforce and that cultural shift towards prioritizing space.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, speaking as an economic development person, a couple of points. I think that at least within the United States, the technical and community colleges are oftentimes a very overlooked resource that for your proverbial hands-on metal bending type of skill sets can provide you with an ongoing pipeline. And also there is typically a lot of money out there to help pay for the training. Also, when you look at where the spaceports line up geographically on the map, and perhaps this is the case in other countries, and where for the 4-year bachelor's degrees and above, where some of the very large, prominent aerospace engineering programs in particular are, there's kind of a geographic mismatch in that a lot of the spaceports are in the southern tier of the US, and you've got a lot of the big kind of engineering degree factories at schools like Purdue, Penn State, Ohio State, which are up in the northern part of the country. And, it may be worth your while as a spaceport, even though those institutions are not geographically within your state, develop some relationships so that you can get access to that talent and, get a look at, say, promising undergraduates as they're about to graduate and move into the workforce. So Ray Stott has a question. What recommendations does the panel have regarding increased cadence at launch sites, not just for launch, but also for returns? How will launch delays and spaceport operational constraints, rescheduling, et cetera, be accomplished whilst maintaining safety? Andy, perhaps might want to take a stab at that.
Yeah, hold on. And this was Ray's, right? This is the
Ray. Yeah, Ray Scott or Stott, excuse me.
Yeah, certainly. Thinking more incrementally about how we schedule, reschedule, scrub would go a long way. Back to the question about the disruption of sea lanes and air lanes. If we can get better at, locking in when we're going to go and when we're going, as in not taking 4-hour blocks, but taking shorter blocks. And if we can get better at knowing when we're going to scrub and not saying, well, there's still a 20% chance we can go, let's wait till the last minute. I think that will do a lot for making sure that we actually do reserve the airspace for when there is a good chance of launch. And then obviously the other real challenge with the cadence at launch sites is just all of the little failure modes that can get you, right? All of the little things that can cause a scrub, and really working on kind of perfecting the, what are the early warning signs that will tell us we need to fix something, as opposed to, again, waiting till the last minute. I think those are probably the most important things to actually sustain a higher launch cadence.
Okay, thanks. Do you, with returns, do you see that that expanding in the horizontal sector? I think probably hasn't taken, no pun intended, taken off as fast as a lot of us would have expected. Obviously you've got returns there, and currently, for vertical, it's only in a very small number of places.
Yeah, and even as we think about just returning reusable parts, you mentioned vertical, maybe that's the place where we build enough evidence to convince regulators that there is a manageable risk for horizontals, that there's a way to do this. Certainly there are different risks for vertical and horizontal, but I think the real challenge for horizontal has maybe been, in the absence of data, what are you approving based on? And so how we work through a paradigm where we actually work the data collection in a way that we can provide some convincing evidence for horizontal safety, horizontal launch and recovery safety, and perhaps returning reusable vehicles out of the vertical launches, while not exactly one-for-one data, it is data. True.
And that's, you have to be thinking about your other tenants there. In Florida, back when SpaceX was first talking about stage return, NRO had just finished their, I think it's about 300,000 square foot, very, very highly classified processing facility on the Air Force Station, and rightly so. They were very, very concerned that a stray stage was going to come down into their brand new, highly classified facility and, cause a whole nother sequence of very, very challenging issues. So Mike has his hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Bernie. I just wanted to add on to the launch cadence question as well. what I think is important to consider is that that's certainly a challenge, especially for the Cape. Very busy, packed launch manifest. What I'd offer is that investing in further automation, modeling, and simulation to really understand the constraints that launch events have across the spaceport system, and in this case, especially Florida-wide. The other side of that, especially for spaceports that are just securing their core anchor tenants, have just begun to start launching. We had a conversation with one spaceport one time that said, hey, our goal is to do simultaneous launch in our facility. And we basically said, hey, that's a great lofty goal for the future. Also, focus on doing 2 launches a year first. Forget about doing 2 launches simultaneously. So just offer that it's less of a hairy problem for spaceports that are starting out locally. But of course, you want to consider that with the overall launch manifest.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. Council, thanks. Okay, let's see. Here's an interesting question. Sabine Shamasi, are mutual aid agreements between spaceports or between launch providers facilitated by spaceports a valid approach for mitigating risk related to mission success? Is there a potential future in investing in that? Maybe Chris, would you like to take a stab at that?
Well, Rich has his hand up, but I'll follow up once he's
sorry,
done.
I missed Rich.
No,
Yeah.
No, it's okay. I was just going to say, yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, that's one of the future things that are going is if I'm running a spaceport, I would absolutely be proactive in seeking international partnerships as well as domestic via trade agreements. And I think making it a trade agreement opens the door for investment, et cetera, on both sides of the spaceport. For example, SpaceX is talking about being able to launch, point to point and deliver a person anywhere in the world in 30 minutes. And my question to either end of the spaceport is, are you ready to receive and send? So absolutely, I think that's going to be a growing area of cooperation.
And I'd just add that the most important thing is to start with your contracts. The launch business is very competitive, both among launch providers and spaceports, but it's important for the spaceport operator to make sure that liability is allocated properly, responsibility is allocated properly, not relying on insurance, but in the broader risk management context, making sure that under your contracts that you've allocated liability and you've expressed who's responsible for what. Again, it's not just the launches, but the landings too. And I think SpaceX has shown, for example, that when it comes to trajectories, they've started flying over the Bahamas, and they've shown that works well for them and for Bahamas as a sovereign entity. If we look at other regions, if you look at the Chinese space launch business, they have 4 launch sites that they use. One of them, Xichang, is deep inland in southwestern China, and they frequently launch. Their drop zones frequently are over villages on the way to the coast. And there have been some notable cases where they have dropped stages on populated areas and caused damage. The Chinese government does require insurance for that, and it is usually done in the Chinese insurance market. But there have been some claims in the past for the Chinese launch operators, particularly the ones launching from Xichang, dropping stages on populated areas. So obviously that's a consideration anywhere. And what the Chinese did then is they built their new launch site on Hainan Island, which is, their trajectories are generally over the water from there. So it's I think it's important to have those mutual aid agreements, but again, it is a competitive business. So I think again, the first stop should be the contracts for everything that goes into operating the spaceport.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So Nick Robson has another question. As the number of spaceports grow across the world, who decides which spaceport gets launch slot and sets the priorities? Mike, I think that kind of gets back to customer choice at the end of the day.
I think so, and it is a challenging question, especially if you have launches from two different nation states that are having conflicting trajectories. In the absence of that, I would venture to say that, particularly for some of the major launch providers that we see in the United States, while that manifest is becoming more and more crowded, it hasn't reached its breaking point yet. I think that prioritization system is working relatively well.
Anyone else on the panel with something to add?
Yeah, I will say one thing about international sea lane and airspace coordination. Certainly, the more complicated that coordination, the harder it will be for just the one site to actually coordinate a launch. And so that's certainly something to think about in terms of the context of your operations as a spaceport. What can you do to make sure that the launch trajectories you'd support would actually have minimal impact on multiple states?
Thanks, Andy. And then Ray has a follow-up workforce question. Regarding workforce development, should we, and I believe you're meaning GSA there or someone else to be determined, lead on curating a specific spaceport qualification certified training, given the current skills gap and talent competition, in order to ensure and capitalize on future opportunities and growth revenues for the global sector? I don't know. That's James. Do you want to jump in here? I don't know if that's something GSA has looked at in the past.
Well, actually, we have looked at it. We are in the process of talking with ISU to potentially develop a program not dissimilar to that. But at the moment, it's still a work in progress, and we don't, frankly, have anything to announce. Okay, but it's definitely something we're looking at very hard.
Okay, thank you. And let's see, things coming up quickly in the chat. And I'm apologies if I mispronounce your name. Pessoa Lopez. I'm currently actively promoting the prime geostrategic Atlantic location of Santa Maria Island, Azores, Portugal, for a European international spaceport. To this ACE panel, thanks for the compliments. Any thoughts, recommendations with regard to navigating its risk at such key defense and submarine cables in the Atlantic corridor? Well, that's interesting. Kind of interplay between different modes, sea and space. So, any thoughts on that? I don't know if
Bernie, I'll take some of my own medicine of navigating risk and not talk about something that I haven't looked into sufficiently. But so I'd be happy to take a look at what you're putting together, do a deep dive to get smarter on it, and then, if suitable, have a follow-up conversation.
Okay, thanks, Mike. And I think maybe one more question. We're coming up on 12 o'clock Eastern time in North America. From Angie Buckley, as the industry continues to grow, any thoughts on workforce development and the risk associated with being able to find, hire, train, and retain individuals with the broad range of skill sets required for successful operations? That's a pretty broad, all-encompassing question. Andy, do you have any sense? Maybe I don't know if the aviation world might be instructive, and kind of what the early days of airports were like, is when airplanes were a new thing, and how did they keep key team members on board as that industry grew and proved itself as it was going to turn into something big?
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there is an analogy there to, this kind of maintaining the capability. And I'm not sure that, maybe I'm fumbling a little bit at the question, but it does seem like what you have to do is you work through that risk in particular of maintaining this talent, maintaining these relationships, is it really comes back to some of the stuff Mike said about your business plan, right? You really have to understand what services you're going to offer, what things are going to differentiate you, why do you exist, I think. I don't know if that gets at what you were asking, but
yeah, that's a good start, and I'll weigh in with some Space Florida experience. Every 3 years, we brought in a very experienced human resources consultant who did a salary survey and looked at all of our different business areas. So for those of us on the business development side, we were benchmarked against folks primarily in the finance world. Those on the Spaceports operations side, it was a little more challenging there, but there was a lot of benchmarking as much as we could garner from other spaceports, and also getting into the aviation airport realm. And going through that exercise every 3 years gave us a good sense of what the market ranges are for each position. And then we could see where our people were, and see in particular, there were some spots where it's amazing how much the world can change in 3 years. That someone, say, was at an 80th percentile 3 years ago. Wow, all of a sudden they've slipped down to 45th percentile. And, you need to do some adjusting upward to stay competitive in the marketplace for that position. So we're at 11:59. So I'm going to thank our panel for a very good discussion, and thanks all of our members for some really excellent, very thoughtful questions, and turn it back over to James for the wrap up.
Okay, Bernie, many, many thanks to all of you. Bernie McShae, of course, McShane Group, Mike, Deloitte, Rich DiLorenzo from Kaiser Solutions, Andy Anderegg from MITRE, and of course, Chris Constator from Trident Space. Thank you all very much. And I hope everyone learned a lot. I certainly did as I was listening today. So thank you all for your participation, and looking forward to seeing you at the Spaceport Summit in January. And in the meantime, take care. Thank you.